central Iran. At 2:15 in the morning, an Iranian radar operator at the Tabas monitoring site stared at a return that should not have been possible. The signature, the size of a heavy strategic bomber, was drifting at the speed of a mountain breeze, holding a steady position over a restricted missile facility. Lieutenant Hassan Rezai rubbed his eyes and adjusted the gain on his console as the signal sat on his screen like a solid weight. The Ghadir radar system, the pride of the Iranian air defense, was tracking something that appeared from nowhere, deep inside protected airspace. Hassan checked secondary systems. Thermal cameras showed the cold blue desert night and empty sky above Dasht-e Kavir under clear stars. Yet the radar return insisted that a massive structure was hovering 4,000 meters above the sand. Hassan spoke into his headset. "Command, this is Tabas Station. I have a track. Designation Victor 701. The response from the regional command center in Isfahan was immediate. Tabas, state your classification. Is this a drone? Hassan looked at the data again, stating the cross-section was too large for a drone, larger than a Boeing 747. There was no engine noise on the long-range acoustic sensors and no heat. It was a ghost. A long pause followed in the silence of the radar room, filled only by the hum of cooling fans and the rhythmic pulse of the sweep. The controller in Isfahan spoke again, reporting no scheduled flights, civilian traffic, or IRGC exercises in the sector. The signal is consistent, Hassan replied. I am slaving the secondary fire control radar to the track. It is not a glitch. Something is up there. Hassan initiated a hard lock. Usually, a stealth aircraft would flicker or disappear when hit with a concentrated beam, but this object did the opposite. The return grew brighter. It seemed to absorb the energy and reflect it back with impossible clarity. Deep in the Arabian Sea, hundreds of miles to the south, the American aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln moved through the swells. Inside the Combat Information Center, an elite team of analysts watched the same patch of sky on a compromised Iranian data link. A senior intelligence officer leaned over a technician's shoulder. The Iranians just went to a hard lock. What are they looking at? The technician reported a massive contact over the Tabas facility on Iranian radar, but found nothing on U.S. assets. The officer narrowed his eyes. If we do not have an asset there, and they think we do, they are going to scramble. The morning was still quiet. It would not stay that way. At the 8th Tactical Air Base near Isfahan at 2:22 in the morning, blue flames erupted from the twin engines of two F-14 Tomcat fighters as they taxied onto the runway. Major Arash Farad felt the vibration of the airframe through his flight suit, while the heavy interceptors, artifacts of an earlier era but formidable tools, prepared for the mission. The tower controller spoke into the radio. Guardian 1. You are cleared for immediate departure. Direct vector to the Tabas site. Climb to 20,000 feet. Major Arash responded, Guardian 1. Copy. Climbing to 20,000. We are in the hunt. Before pushing throttles forward as the F-14 roared down the strip and lifted into the night. Beside him, his wingman followed in a tight formation as they turned north toward Tabas, over a void of black desert and cold distant stars. 400 miles away, inside the pressurized cabin of an E-2 Hawkeye, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Vance sat in the darkened mission bay, watching the glowing tactical display. She saw the two Iranian fighters climb at Mach 1.2 toward a patch of sky that was empty on her screen, with no transponders or heat signatures. Vance spoke into her internal headset, Control. This is Raven 1. We are tracking two Iranian F-14s targeting a point in space over Tabas. We have no contact on that position. The USS Abraham Lincoln responded, confirming zero signal, while Vance noted that Iranian ground stations were acting like there was a mountain in the sky. Inside the lead F-14, Major Arash was struggling as his radar intercept officer worked the controls of the powerful ANAWG-9 radar. The officer reported a massive return, sitting at zero relative velocity 5 miles ahead, yet the visual remained clear with nothing but stars. Arash narrowed his eyes and flipped his night vision goggles down. The world turned grainy green as he searched the horizon for a silhouette or flicker. Control, Arash said. I am at the intercept point. Radar shows a target. Visual is negative. I am closing to 1 mile, as the controller advised caution near the American perimeter. As he crossed the 1 mile mark, His cockpit instruments began to spin. The artificial horizon flipped upside down and digital clocks reset to 0. His wingman's voice crackled over the radio, distorted by heavy static. "Arash, my engines are surging. I am losing power." The lead 14 shook violently. A low, rhythmic hum filled the cockpit, a vibration that felt like it was coming from inside his own skull. Major Arash looked out the canopy. Less than 500 meters away, the stars began to bend, and the light of the Milky Way curved around an invisible sphere. He reached for the radio, saying, "Control, I have a visual anomaly. The sky is folding," before every light in his cockpit went black. At 2:30 in the morning, Major Arash Farad gripped the control stick of his 14 over the Iranian desert, as the absolute silence in the cockpit was replaced by a wrong, rhythmic thrum. Every digital display was a void of black glass. He reached for the emergency lighting switch, but nothing happened as he hurtled through the night at 1,200 kilometers per hour. Beside him, the canopy glass began to frost over. The temperature was dropping rapidly despite the cockpit heaters. Arash looked to his left and could just make out the silhouette of his wingman, Guardian 2. The other Tomcat was drifting, its navigation lights flickering like a dying candle. Arash spoke into his backup radio, "Guardian 2. Status, do you have power?" The reply was a wall of white noise with a single emerged word, "Negative." The Major looked forward. The stars were no longer points of light. They were elongated, stretching into curved lines that circled a central point of absolute darkness. It was as if a massive, invisible lens had been placed in front of his jet, physically displacing the light of the universe while refusing to reflect a single photon of its own. 400 miles south, the Combat Information Center of the USS Abraham Lincoln was electric with tension, blue tactical consoles illuminating the faces of 40 sailors. The admiral stood behind the commander. "Report. What happened to those Tomcats?" The commander pointed to a massive spike in wide-spectrum interference on the main screen. "Admiral, this is not a jammer. It is a noise floor rising across every frequency. The atmosphere itself is becoming a conductor," the technician reported. "Launch the alert fighters," the admiral ordered. "I want 2 F-35s at the border of the Iranian search region. Stay dark. Use passive infrared sensors only." 2 F-35 Lightning fighters moved to the catapults of the carrier, the most advanced sensors in the sky, before climbing into the humid air and turning north. The Iranians had 2 crippled fighters circling an invisible object, while the Americans had 2 stealth interceptors rushing toward the same point, both sides assuming the other responsible. Inside the dark cockpit, Major Arash felt the stick vibrate with a rhythmic pulsing like a heartbeat. 1, 2, 1, 2. He looked at his standby compass. The needle was spinning in a clockwise circle, faster and faster, until it became a blur. The sky was no longer quiet, as the electronic screams of 4 nations focused on a single coordinate in the desert, while Arash was drawn toward a non-existent center of gravity. 2:38 in the morning, the Iranian National Air Defense Center in Tehran, General Mahmoud Karimi, stood before a wall-sized projection of the national airspace, where 2 blue 14 icons were blinking. A young officer reported intermittent communication with Guardian 1, noting total electrical failure of primary systems with the pilots flying on manual backups. Karimi suspected American jamming, but the officer noted broad interference affecting civilian and military bands, with 2 high-speed F-35 contacts crossing the Gulf without transponders. "Tell Guardian 1 to execute a kinetic probe. Fire his 20mm cannon into the center of the anomaly," Karimi ordered, ignoring the risk of war. 60 miles away, Archer adjusted his helmet-mounted display in his F-35, viewing the heat signatures of the 2 Iranian Tomcats as ghosts against the cold black atmosphere. Woodsman confirmed his sensors were clean, no radar, heat, or wake turbulence, yet the Iranians were acting like they were flying around a skyscraper. Inside the lead 14, Major Arash Farad felt the weight of the command, switching his weapon system to manual override as he aimed at a hole in the universe where stars distorted. He squeezed the trigger on the stick, and the M61 Vulcan cannon roared, sending a stream of 20mm tracer rounds slicing through the night. The tracers moved in a straight line, then reached the boundary where they didn't ricochet or explode, but simply stopped, frozen in mid-flight. Within seconds, a curved wall of glowing red tracers was suspended in the sky, outlining the edge of something massive and perfectly spherical. Archer whispered about the physical barrier as the red glow of the frozen bullets began to pulse and the vibration in Arash's cockpit shifted from a hum to a scream. 2:45 in the morning in the central Iranian desert, Major Arash Farad stared through his canopy at a wall of red light where tracers were suspended in a perfect glowing curve. Major Arash spoke into his primary radio with cracking tension, reporting that the rounds were not passing through but were being held in place. Tabas station responded through static, confirming a thermal spike and physical boundary, ordering a red threat level and orbit while additional interceptors launched from Shiraz. Arash looked at his wingman, Guardian 2, a dark shape against the cold stars, both pilots acting as paralyzed defenders of a boundary they did not understand. 400 miles south on the USS Abraham Lincoln, the Admiral watched the infrared feed from the F-35s showing a perfect sphere 60 meters in diameter hovering above Iranian soil. Intercut. The Admiral ordered Archer to move in, while Archer, sweat cooling on his forehead inside the F-35, reported climbing interference and a visual on the fuel-low Tomcats. Archer pushed his throttles forward, surging the F-35 into the same airspace as the Iranian fighters, neither side willing to blink. Mobile surface-to-air missile batteries deployed around Tabas as radars illuminated the sky, searching for targets already in front of them in the thick, charged air. Archer and Woodsman felt a low-frequency pulse vibrating their control sticks, a rhythmic surge coming directly from the sphere. Major Arash felt the same pulse as a pressure in his chest. The frozen tracers began to drift inward as the sphere started to consume the light it had caught. 2:51 in the morning over the Tabas desert, the wall of red light was gone as the suspended tracers were pulled into the center of the void with violent acceleration. The sphere was no longer passive. The distortion of the stars was spreading and growing larger, stretching like a drop of ink in water. Tehran screamed over the distorted radio about American contacts at 6 o'clock. Major Arash turned his F-14 in a high-gravity bank, switching to his infrared search and track sensor. The infrared display flickered to life, showing two bright white pinpoints against the cold black atmosphere, the F-35s flying in a staggered combat spread. Inside the lead F-35, Archer heard a steady missile warning as his helmet-mounted display flashed a crimson border, reporting to Woodsman that they were being painted. The Admiral authorized countermeasures and self-defense if a launch was detected, ordering them not to fire first, but not to lose those aircraft. An Iranian SAM commander watched the Americans enter the kill zone, his finger hovering over the launch button for a Mersad missile battery while waiting for Tehran. Major Arash had a steady heat-seeker growl in his headset, his finger tightening on the trigger as Tehran authorized him to fire now. The air around the sphere began to shimmer and ripple, space itself rippling as the stars behind the object vanished into total darkness. The vibration in all four cockpits reached a roar. Needles in the F-14 snapped off, while the digital glass in the F-35s turned into white static. Archer and Arash felt their aircraft being pulled toward the shimmering center. Both pilots fought the controls as their engines screamed in protest. The world went white as a silent, absolute explosion of brilliance filled the desert from horizon to horizon, blinding every sensor and eye. At 2:52 in the morning, the command centers in Tehran and the Arabian Sea fell silent as every monitor in the USS Abraham Lincoln CIC became a featureless white. The technicians stared at their consoles, their hands hovering over keyboards that no longer responded. The powerful AEGIS system, the heart of the carrier's defense, had been neutralized by a single surge of energy. In the Iranian bunker, General Karimi looked at a blank wall where the massive projection of the national airspace was gone. The hum of the servers had vanished, replaced by the smell of cooling electronics and the sound of heavy breathing. High above the desert, the white flash retreated into a pinpoint, and as vision returned, the pilots realized they were no longer in control. Inside his F-35, Archer pulled on the control stick, but the sophisticated fly-by-wire system was locked in a neutral position. He looked at his wingman, Woodsman, as both jets moved in a perfectly straight line, drifting away from the anomaly at exactly 300 knots. Major Arash experienced the same phenomenon, his F-14 guided away from the sphere by an invisible hand. The ghost was no longer invisible. The distortion of the stars had solidified into a sphere of liquid glass. The tracers he had fired appeared as tiny, frozen silver flecks caught in the pulsing violet skin of the object. The sphere was glowing with a faint, pulsing violet light, rippling the air around it like it was breathing. Archer and Woodsman observed that the object was not a drone, while below them, the sand of the Tabas facility was beginning to glow. A circle of blue light appeared on the desert floor, vitrifying the sand into glass under the pressure from above. The 2 Iranian Tomcats and the 2 American Lightnings were now flying in a 4-ship formation, wings less than 50 meters apart. Arash looked to his left at the gray silhouette of the F-35, and Archer looked back. 2 witnesses acknowledging a shared reality. The sphere began to rotate, and the vibration in the cockpits shifted to a high, melodic whistle as the violet light intensified. Then, the pressure vanished, control sticks snapped back to life, and the digital displays flickered and rebooted. The sphere contracted, shrinking from 60 meters to the size of a marble in less than a second before vanishing with a sharp intake of breath. The sky was empty, the stars were straight, and the radar at Tabas began to sweep a clean, blue screen. At 2:56 in the morning over the skies of central Iran, the sudden return of physics was as violent as its departure as Major Arash Farad felt the weight of his F-14 return. Beside him, the 2 American F-35s were also recovering, banking away and regaining their combat spread with professional precision. Arash asked Tabas Station if they had a radar return, and they reported the sky was clear but for a massive thermal scar on the desert floor. In the Combat Information Center of the USS Abraham Lincoln, the Admiral watched the digital ghosts of the F-35s reappear on the tactical screen. Archer reported that the object contracted and dissipated, simply ceasing to occupy space, while his systems were 90% recovered. "Return to base," the Admiral ordered, as the 2 F-35s banked hard toward the south and the safety of the carrier strike group. Arash watched them go and looked down at the desert floor, where the glowing blue circle was already fading into a jagged ring of obsidian. Arash told the Tehran controller he had insufficient fuel and structural stress, refusing to pursue as he returned to Isfahan. "Understood. Guardian 1. Return to base. Do not discuss this mission on open channels," the authority voice commanded. The crisis of the Ghost had ended, but the crisis of understanding was just beginning as both nations remained powerless and silent. Over the Tabas desert at 3:15 in the morning, the silence that followed the disappearance of the sphere was heavier than the roar of the engines. Major Arash Farad maintained his orbit for a final 2 minutes, staring at the empty air while his radar screen was clean. The atmospheric distortion had vanished as if it had never existed, while below, the glowing ring in the sand was cooling into a dull, jagged black. It was the only physical evidence that the laws of physics had been suspended over Iranian soil. Arash checked his fuel gauge, seeing he was deep into his reserves, and banked his F-14 toward the west, heading back to Isfahan. His wingman followed, the 2 aging interceptors moving like ghosts through the night as neither pilot spoke. 400 miles to the south, the 2 American F-35 fighters approached the USS Abraham Lincoln under a strange, purposeful silence. Archer climbed down from his cockpit with heavy legs and was met on the deck by 2 intelligence officers leading him to a windowless room. The Admiral was already there, looking at a series of printouts. "Archer, sit down." "Sir," Archer said, removing his helmet. "My flight recorders, are they being pulled?" The Admiral looked up with a pale face, explaining that the solid-state drives in both aircraft were blank, not damaged, but zeroed out. Every bit of data from the moment you entered the 5-mile radius of that object has been erased. Archer felt a chill, asking about the carrier's radar and the Hawkeye, as the Admiral confirmed a 30-second gap in the entire fleet's digital memory. In Tehran, General Karimi stood in the technical lab watching experts examine the flight data recorder from Major Arash's Tomcat, finding the magnetic tape blank. The general looked at satellite imagery showing a perfect obsidian ring, 60 meters across, on the desert floor. A technician reported the sand had melted into high-purity silica with traces of an unknown isotope, as Karimi thought of the Americans doing the same. Both nations realized their military doctrines of total awareness were a delusion, like children playing with sticks under a storm. No one wanted to claim responsibility or admit their most advanced weapons were turned into paperweights by a marble of light. The desert wind began to blow across the Tabas facility, covering the glass ring with a thin layer of dust. The world was returning to normal, but the normalcy was a lie. 3 days later, the obsidian ring near Tabas was quietly cordoned off by a specialized unit of the Revolutionary Guard, officially designated for geological research. Inside a secure conference room in Langley, a group of senior analysts reviewed the thin final report, containing only blurred images of the aftermath. The lead analyst stated the event was not human interference, as the energy required exceeded the total power output of every nuclear reactor on Earth. In Tehran, General Karimi sat with Major Arash Farad, who looked exhausted after 72 hours of interrogation, his eyes clear despite the fatigue. Karimi noted that the enemy wasn't the Americans, but their own insignificance, while looking at a piece of the obsidian glass on his desk. The encounter created a silent pact. Pilots on both sides began to give each other more space. Understanding the sky was no longer a private battlefield. Humanity had found the answer. Their conflict was nothing more than the buzzing of insects in the eyes of whatever was watching. The morning sun rose over the Dasht-e Kavir as the obsidian ring was already being reclaimed by the blowing dunes. Modern warfare is decided not by who fires first, but by who understands the limit of their own power.